I'm Naman. I'm a product manager here at Stoplight, and primarily I wanted to talk to you about today about component libraries. This is a new feature that we have released in Stoplight in beta. So I'll get started with that. Today, we're going to be talking about a few things in this order. So I'm going to start with the challenges of API design at scale. So once you're building a lot of APIs, what kind of challenges do you face? And how do component libraries help with that? This new feature that we have released, this came out of organizations building a large number of libraries and seeing issues. So I'll talk about how that helps. And then going forward from that, like what kind of models do you include in these component libraries? So how do you structure these libraries themselves? Some best practices around that, giving a demo of the feature, and probably not getting any questions today, but hopefully I'll try and address some of those as I walk through the presentation itself. So before I get into API design at scale, one big piece that we've been focusing on as Stoplight, especially in this governance space that we've been releasing a few features on, is consistency and reliability. Also reusability. As you build a lot of APIs, building consistent APIs is a very important piece. And this is one of the more important goals that you look forward to when you're doing API governance within your API program. And one thing that you do to achieve that is you reusing stuff as much as you can. So the problem that with building a large number of APIs is that it's hard to avoid you probably have a lot of different teams working in different geographical locations on different products, and it's hard to maintain consistency, avoiding people building different. Let's say you have 5 different kinds of user models or error models within the same organization. That not only affects the quality of APIs within the organization, but it also affects the developer experience for consumers trying to use the APIs if they're external or partners. And without proper governance in place, and governance has a lot of different moving pieces, we're going to be talking about one aspect of it. It's hard to ensure that everybody's on the same page. They are aware of the proper guidelines or standards that this organization wants to follow. So how does component libraries help with this? Component libraries allow creating these shared libraries that contain common models that are reused across different APIs. Now you can create this library on an organization level or a team level, and then reuse it across different projects. What this does is saves you time. So new developers coming in or people designing APIs don't need to redo the same thing over and over again. It also reduces errors, because once you're reusing the same standards that a team has put conscious effort into, you're going to make less mistakes. You're going to follow the standards that are already there, follow best practices, hopefully. And it improves collaboration, because you get a lot of different teams now having conversations about what do these models look like, what needs to be added to them. So there's a lot more collaboration, and you break down these silos that these teams are potentially building APIs in. So just breaking it down, one piece that component libraries does, it's the primary use case of it is reusability. So you build these models once, you reuse them across all projects, and it follows the dry method. So you do not repeat yourself when building different APIs within different teams. And that's always good when it comes to programming and software in general. It helps with consistency and predictability. So it's not just internal developers that get gains out of it. If you're using similar models across different APIs that you put out for different partners, different customers, they're going to have a similar experience, less time trying to integrate these APIs and less time trying to debug errors with it, because they're consistent. So they know what to expect out of it and potentially get to value much faster. It also improves onboarding. So now with teams growing in different regions, a new designer or developer coming in, getting them up to speed with standards. One way that you can go about it is them going deep into code and trying to familiarize themselves, which takes more time, certainly results in errors. Um, these libraries help them understand very quickly what do APIs, what do code APIs look like within this organization, and then get started with just reusing some of these resources and not having to build them. And then when they're actually building things themselves or building resources themselves, they'd have a good understanding of what good looks like within the organization too. And finally, I already touched on this in the first slide. It's once you have different teams collaborating on these shared resources, reusing them, you have a lot of back and forth, which is good just in generally in improving the best practices across the organization, but also breaking down these silos. So you might find that duplicate APIs at less because people are talking about, okay, I'm using this resource. Do I need to build an API? Or does an API already exist out there? So I might just end up using that API and improving on it. And breaking down these silos, especially in this remote first cross country company culture that we've built, it's really important. You do not have the time to have conversations within the office. So these tools like component libraries really help with that. Just to quickly summarize this, the key benefits are you'd get consistency and reuse, but you'd also improve your developer experience within the organization by improving the onboarding and collaboration within these different teams building component libraries. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do a deep dive into component libraries themselves and what do they actually do. So before getting into the actual feature, I want to talk about how Stoplight thinks about governance. So we started with style guides, which was primarily about enforcing rules. You create a list of rules, conventions, best practices, and then enforce them across your organization. But this helps with best practices and conventions in terms of casing, in terms of these are the error responses that I really want to build out. The next step that we did with this was added discussions, which helps you collaborate on these designs. So you can add comments, people can have discussions, and really talk about where things need to improve. Now, finally, we've added component libraries, which is about reuse. I talked about it before too. You can create these libraries that you can then consume in different API projects. And the idea is this really, on the design side of governance, gives you the right tooling to build conventions, build best practices, but also build a set of resources that can be reused and can be maintained by teams that are consciously thinking about these, and then have discussions around them. So this is currently the governance story in Stoplight. Getting into component libraries themselves, the first step of this is creating the library itself. So you have a separate project type now within Stoplight, where for now it just supports models. So you can add models, common models that you have that can be reused across a company or across teams. Add them to a project, create them using the JSON schema editor that our users are pretty used to, and then publish it for others to consume. We create documentation for the library itself, much like we create documentation for APIs, so you can use that to socialize the component library across an organization. The next step is once you've published it, users who are designing APIs within their type editor now can easily now see models that they have within their API, but also models from these different component libraries. So if you have one or multiple component libraries that show up in this component section in Studio, and they can easily start consuming APIs from multiple component library projects, depending on what their use case is. It's now much easier to find. There's a search up there, a filter. So finding these is also important because once you've built these shared libraries, you want to see adoption for them. If somebody's creating an error response You want the error model to be used and not them building it on their own. The next step, and this is some feedback that we got from some previous iterations of this feature, was that once you're building these APIs, you've built these libraries, it's really important to iterate on them and iterate with these. So what we've done is these teams that are maintaining component libraries can go and make updates without being worried that this might break it for consumer. So once they update something like, say, the customer model within their library, anybody who's consuming the model already gets a notification for the update. They get a visual diff where they can see what has been added, what has been changed. If there's a breaking change, that would show up too. And then they can opt in to update it. Now they opt in whenever they want. So if it's an API already in the wild, they might choose to do it in the next version. If it's a breaking change, they might want to push some minor version of the API if it's a small change, or might just ignore the update itself. Or if it's something that they're designing still, they can take in this new update and just choose to update to the latest so that they're following the latest best practices in terms of models that the organization has. All right, so this is how you go about creating and consuming shared libraries, but what to include in it. So if you have domain models, so let's say you're an e-commerce company with a product model which is used across multiple APIs, put that into a component library. So you don't end up creating different versions of it or having to duplicate in different places. An error model or pagination models are pretty common models to put in the design library itself, and it really helps standardize this, albeit is sometimes very hard to standardize across an organization. So if you have the same error model, at least you're reporting errors in the same way, and I'm sure your users would love that. If you have some common data types across different domains within your organization, put that into the component library. Metadata object. So if you have a metadata object that is returned with each response or goes with each request, just common across different APIs, that can go into it. If in enumerations, you have country codes that are just used across different APIs. And we'll talk about how there's potentially a use case for that enumeration to be changed a bit in different environments and different APIs. We'll talk about that and how the roadmap looks like for that too. And if you're using a standard like JSON API, there are standard models for response for errors that should certainly go into the component library, because that really helps with actually promoting that standard and making sure people are adhering to it itself. What kind of best practices should we follow when creating these? So there are two levels or multiple that you can create these component libraries on. So company-wide models that are used across the organization can go into a company-wide component library. But there are team or domain-specific libraries that you might want to build too. There's a certain domain that uses models across a set of APIs, put those into a component library too, just so that there's reuse on each level and not just this whole organization level. And put the scope and purpose of each library into the description for the project, because you don't want people to be reusing something from another domain that might end up causing issues. Document the models clearly with descriptions and examples, same as for APIs. If they are to be reused, they have to be of the high standard. This potentially also promotes some of those best practices downstream to actual API designers who are building these building APIs from these models. If you have good descriptions, they might take the same thing and put that into their models within APIs too. And like I said, if you're using standards already like JSON API, put those into component libraries too, so that more people are adhering to standards. If you're doing something different with the standard, like not using it completely or changing something, you can adapt it to your specific requirements within the component library, so that that is also that also goes downstream. We create documentation for the component library itself. You get a documentation page that you can share across the team, put in a link on the workspace, or share it in your Slack just so that people know this design component library is available. It's also available in Studio, like I showed, but sharing it across other channels would certainly help too. And iterating and getting feedback on the component library is always very important too. So this is what component libraries has today, but we're also looking to add some more things to it. I'd really love to get some feedback on if these are the right things that you'd want added or there's something else. So the next thing that we're looking to add is masking. What masking allows you to do is, say you have a product model, but it's used differently within different APIs. Say a property is removed, or the description needs to be changed, something's required or not. That could also be a use case for potentially doing it differently in request and responses. You can create a mask for it. So the same model, but create a mask for it, and whenever the parent model is updated, the mask would get that update too. So you're not really duplicating and then changing things. You're still keeping the relationship. And that really helps, again, one, easy to manage and promote the reuse of the same components. Today, component libraries just supports JSON schema models, but we're moving forward. We want to support headers, parameters, security schemes. We've gotten some requests for responses and requests to be part of component libraries too, but certainly looking for more feedback on what needs to go next into these component libraries as you start building and using them. Also, feedback on the whole feature itself would be really appreciated. All right, so now I'd want to go into the demo itself and show actual usage of the component library. So if you all can see my workspace, what I have here is I've already created a component library that I'm going to show you, but generally if somebody's coming in, just getting started, if you add a new project within Stoplight, we already had API and style guide as options of projects, but now component library is an added one. So if I go into a component library, today I can just create a blank component library and then import models within it. So there's a Stoplight project or a Git project. In the future, we'd also want to allow importing Git repositories directly, but today you can create a Git project and then just import JSON schema files within that. I'll just get started with a component library you already have. So give it a name that matches its scope. So if it's an organization level component library, give it that kind of name, or if it's for a team, that way. And you can choose who gets to edit it, but everybody would still see it. So if I go into editing the component library itself, it would look very much like what Studio looks like today for APIs, but you do not see the APIs option. The only thing you can do today is add models. You can reference other component libraries, so there can be an inherited structure. Let's say you have an organization level library that defines common models, but then a team level library uses those models to build upon the same concepts, but something specific for their domain or team. So what I have here is a few models, like a user and a product model, which is commonly used, but then I also have a metadata that I talked about. This goes into every response. An error model, any errors that I create, I can give it the same model. And so as you define models within an API, you can go ahead and define those within a component library and go ahead and publish it. So once you publish a component library, that's available for all APIs that are within the organization to start using that within the workspace. So I'll go into one of these APIs. Let's say I have the order management API. And what I want to show here is, like, you built a single library that has the models, and then you can start reusing them. So let's say I want to give a list of orders. The order needs to use a user object. And as a designer, when I add a user object, I go into components and I see that there's already a user object defined by my organization's component library. So instead of coming in here and defining it again, finding documentation for it, and then building it, and then never getting updates for it, I can just choose to use the user model here. Same goes for the product model that I've reused here, a metadata model that goes into every response of mine. So this has been, there are a few fields that I've added, but primarily built out of things that are already available in my organization's component library. Makes me faster, makes me reuse stuff, and I'm potentially following a lot more best practices than I would have if I were starting from scratch. Same goes for, say, I want to put in an error response. I define a 400 error. I give it the schema that is already in the component library. So I'm following a similar structure for defining errors and not having to redo it, not potentially building inconsistencies. So this is one example of me using some models from component libraries. There might be multiple other APIs. So I have a product catalog, a user management API within the same organization. It needs to use the product model, the user model. All of them have been defined in a single place, and all of them are reusing it from the component library. Now, I go into a component library. I'm the creator of the component library, and I want to update it. Now, one worry that I might have is that people are already using it, and things might break for them. But like I mentioned in my slides, that's not the case. So let's say my team decided that the user model needs to have a new field called role. Now, I could just go ahead and publish it without having to worry that this is going to break things. So this is me building a minor version update. So if you're building a completely new library, the recommendation would be either to do it in a new branch or do a completely new library itself. But if you're just iterating on these models, even if it's a breaking change, then you can just make a change here and push that upstream to consumers. Now, if we go back into the same API that we know is using a user model, and what you'd see is that I should get a notification that there has been an update. I go in there and click on this, and what I see is that within this component library that I'm using, there's a model that has been updated. I click on it and I click review. And what I see is that the role model has been, the role field has been added. I was making a few changes before that too. So there are a few other changes, but yellow says there are changes, but green says the field has been added. If this is a breaking change, so let's say the role field was required, it would also tell me that this is a breaking change. Now I can choose to either accept this change or ignore it. So now once I accept this change, what we'll see is within here, I should now get the role field, which is added from one of my component libraries. So yes, this is primarily mostly what component libraries are about today. You can create them, consume them, and iterate on them, get some feedback, use the discussion features within Stoplight, or have discussion somewhere else. But update these models and add models to these libraries and keep reusing them. Like I talked about before, what we don't want to do next is add masking to these models. So let's say I'm using a user model, I can go ahead and change some of those models, make them required, make some fields required, remove them, or update the description for a model or a property. And same goes for then supporting other things like headers, parameters, security schemes potentially. Hopefully this was helpful.
And we do have quite a few questions. So first off, what's the difference between components and models?
Oh, so components is just because, like I talked about in our roadmap, components is an umbrella term that we're trying to use for models today, but headers, parameters, things that you can reuse. So design components that you can reuse across an organization. We don't want to just limit this to sharing JSON schema models. We also want to add other things. So component libraries would be you building a list of reusable components like parameters, models, headers, that can then be reused across the APIs.
And then does this work with Studio Desktop or web only?
This is a web only feature, and primarily the reason is that this is collaborative in nature. Once one person's building a library, the other's consuming it. So this is available in web, like you might see the references or Stoplight references too. And this is behind the Pro and Enterprise plan. So this is just for web only, and it won't be coming to desktops. If you're looking to use collaboration features like design library, component libraries or style guides, web's the way to go in that sense.
Will it be possible to have a shared canonical type model with extensions to reuse in query and path parameters? We have to get customer ID contacts, etc. And we want to say the ID is the customer ID type and import its extensions. We need it for our security layer.
Okay, so if I'm getting the question right, the question is that if you have X extensions within the component library, was within the model, would those be mapped onto the parameter itself? They should be. So yes, the X extensions should map onto if you're using it in the query parameter, if I'm getting the question right.
And then in the Git project in Stoplight, global tags are set, and they have name, webhooks, description, everything about users. API paths are referenced from JSON files. And in JSON, I have added the tag using tags, webhooks. You can see the writing in the question. But in documentation tags, they don't seem to reflect this. Is this related to the style guide?
Okay, so you're setting global tags on an open API model level. So what we use, I'll talk about what we do with tags today. If you set a tag on an endpoint or on a model, we use it to group models within the documentation. So those tags should be used, first tag, not all, the first tag should be used to group it within the documentation. Now with global tags, if that's defined in an open API level, we don't do anything with it today. We can potentially use it for discovery. And we have been talking about some of those use cases where you can use those to find APIs. But in terms of grouping documentation, it's the first tag on an endpoint or a model. And same goes for design libraries, or component libraries. It's the tags are used to group things in the documentation. It doesn't show up in the type editor today. Like it doesn't group it in the type editor, but that's something that we're looking to add on or improve on, so that you can easily find group models.
And can you give an example of a use case for metadata?
So like I shared in my example, if you add timestamp or other metadata about the response, like create date for models, or if you give that, put that kind of metadata into each response, that metadata could be standardized and just created within the component library, and then every response could use it. You see a lot of APIs with a data field and then some metadata within it. So that could be achieved using a component library model.
And then last but not least, in our project, we have different ENV like stage, QA, prod. The code deployment will have different versions in these ENV. So far, we've gone through Stoplight docs, used Git branching to map to the Stoplight project, different versions. But the challenge that we are facing is the server link. In case of any deployment, we need to update the server URL for that ENV. For example, I have a QA ENV deployment that I need to update the server URL before I can do deployment.
Yeah, thank you, really. I read that through. This is sorry. It's what you're primarily looking for, I believe, is server parameters. So what you want to define as just a parameter for the server and, like, say, the environment, and then pass that as a variable, or set that as a variable within the open API. Because Stoplight doesn't support that within the documentation or Studio today, but Open API does. So if you look into that, and that's primarily solves for your use case, then we can potentially implement that within our product. Oh yeah, if you all can provide feedback, use the feature itself, try it out, let us know what you would want to add into this or what needs to change, how the UX is. There's a feedback form that we've created. All feedback is really welcome and really useful because we really want to improve on this and governance in general within Stoplight. So.